The dust of Oklahoma Territory in 1872 settled heavy on everything, including the hearts of its people. For Sarah, a kind widow whose hands knew the softness of a well-tended garden and the comfort of a mended shirt, the dust felt like a shroud. Her small cabin, once a place of quiet happiness with her husband Thomas, now felt terribly empty. Thomas had been a strong man, a good man, but a sudden fever had taken him in the cruelest way, leaving Sarah alone in a world that suddenly seemed eager to judge her. Whispers had begun even before Thomas was cold in the ground. Folks in the small settlement of Harmony Creek, a place more known for its harshness than its namesake, looked at Sarah with narrowed eyes. "Too quiet," some mumbled, recalling how she often sat on her porch, watching the sunset alone. "Her herbs," others whispered, remembering the simple remedies she used for common ailments, remedies learned from her grandmother. In their fear and their hunger for someone to blame for their own hard lives, these whispers grew into shouts. Sarah had always been a gentle soul, with eyes the color of a summer sky and hair like spun moonlight. She helped her neighbors without asking for much in return, sharing her small harvest and a comforting word when she could. But kindness, it seemed, was not always enough to protect one from suspicion. After Thomas's death, the town's worries seemed to latch onto her like burrs on a traveler's clothes. A cow fell ill, and someone pointed to Sarah. A child had a bad dream, and her name was muttered. The accusations, at first soft and sly, soon grew bold and loud. "Witch!" they cried, their voices growing sharper each day. Sarah didn't understand. She had only ever tried to do good, to live a peaceful life. She missed Thomas terribly, and the pain of his loss was still fresh. Yet, instead of comfort, she found herself facing cold stares and fearful glares. Her small acts of kindness, like helping a sick animal or knowing which wild plant could soothe a cough, were twisted into dark deeds. She tried to explain, her voice soft against the rising tide of fear. She tried to show them her worn Bible, to remind them of her simple faith. But the fear in Harmony Creek had a tight grip, and once it had taken hold, it did not let go easily. The townsfolk, led by a few loud voices, saw what they wanted to see. Not a grieving widow, but a woman to blame. And so Sarah, who had only known love and quiet devotion, found herself trapped by the dark shadow of unfair accusations. Her simple life was about to be turned upside down in a way she could never have imagined. The whispers about Sarah soon reached the ears of Judge Blackwood, a man whose heart was as cold and hard as the iron stove in his office. He wasn't truly a judge, more like a man who took power for himself in Harmony Creek, deciding what was right and wrong based on who paid him the most or who he disliked. His face was often red, his eyes small and beady, always looking for a way to get ahead, even if it meant hurting others. He liked to show his power, especially to those who had little of their own. When Sarah was brought before him, she trembled like a leaf in the wind. The small courtroom, usually used for land disputes or petty arguments, was packed with townsfolk. Their faces, once familiar, were now a blur of anger and fear. Judge Blackwood sat at a makeshift bench, a stern frown on his face. He didn't listen to Sarah's soft pleas, nor did he care for the truth. He only heard the loud shouts of the townsfolk, their calls for justice ringing in his ears. To him, Sarah was an easy target, a way to look strong and keep the people quiet. The trial was a joke, a cruel play acted out for the crowd. No real proof was offered, just stories of bad luck and fearful imaginings. Sarah tried to speak, to tell them of her love for Thomas, of her simple life, but her voice was drowned out by the angry cries. The judge, with a greedy glint in his eye, cut her off each time. He pretended to listen, tapping his fingers impatiently on the dusty wooden table. He looked at the crowd, then back at Sarah, a wicked smile playing on his lips. He knew what the people wanted, and he was happy to give it to them. It would make him seem like a hero, a strong leader in their eyes. He cleared his throat loudly, making sure everyone was listening. "Sarah Mae Jenkins," he boomed, his voice echoing in the small room. "You stand accused of witchcraft, of dark dealings that have brought misfortune upon Harmony Creek. He paused, letting his words hang heavy in the air. Have you anything to say for yourself? Sarah, her eyes welling with tears, shook her head slowly. What was there to say? There. They wouldn't believe her anyway. I am innocent, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. But the judge didn't care. He slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. Silence, he roared. This court finds you guilty. A gasp went through the room, quickly followed by murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Sarah felt her heart sink. She looked around, desperate for a friendly face, but found none. For the crime of witchcraft, Judge Blackwood declared, his voice filled with false importance. I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The world spun around her. She was to die, all because of fear and a mean man's greed. The days following Judge Blackwood's cruel sentence passed in a blur of fear and disbelief for Sarah. She spent them locked in a small, cold cell, the rough wooden walls doing little to keep out the chill of despair. She thought of Thomas, of their simple dreams, and how unfairly her life was ending. Each sunrise brought her closer to the terrible day. Finally, the morning of the hanging arrived. The air was crisp and clear, a beautiful morning that felt wrong for such a dark event. Sarah was led from her cell, her hands bound tightly in front of her. A small crowd had already gathered in the town square, their faces grim and silent, a mix of curiosity and grim satisfaction. The gallows, a rough wooden structure built overnight, stood tall and stark against the blue sky, a grim monument to fear. Sarah's legs felt like jelly, each step a struggle. Her simple dress, once a soft blue, was now faded and dusty. She looked at the faces in the crowd, hoping to see a hint of pity, a flash of recognition from someone she had helped. But most looked away or stared with hard, unfeeling eyes. Judge Blackwood stood nearby, his chest puffed out, enjoying the show he had created. Slowly, painfully, Sarah climbed the creaky wooden steps of the gallows. The platform swayed slightly under her weight. From up there, she could see the whole town, her small cabin far in the distance. A wave of sadness washed over her, thinking of the quiet life she was losing. A heavy, thick rope coiled at the top waited for her. A man with a grim face, the town's reluctant hangman, stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the rope. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to find a moment of peace. She pictured Thomas's kind face, his warm smile. She whispered a silent prayer. The hangman, his face pale, gently guided the rough loop over her head. The coarse fibers of the rope brushed against her skin, sending shivers down her spine. It was thick and smelled of hemp and fear. He tightened it slowly, carefully, around her neck. It wasn't tight enough to hurt yet, but she could feel its weight, its promise. Her breath hitched in her throat. The world seemed to shrink to just that rough circle around her neck. She could hear the quiet murmur of the crowd below, the distant cry of a bird, and the pounding of her own heart. This was it. This was truly the end. A tear escaped her closed eye, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Just as the hangman's hand moved to pull the lever, a sudden, loud sound ripped through the quiet morning. It was the thunder of hooves growing louder with each beat, shaking the very ground beneath Sarah's feet. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, gasped and turned as one, their faces showing a mixture of shock and terror. A rider burst into the town square, a whirlwind of dust and speed. He was on a powerful black horse, its mane flying wild. The man himself was a fearsome sight. He wore a dark duster coat that flapped around him like a raven's wings, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, hiding his eyes in shadow. A rifle was slung across his back, and 2 pistols rested easily in holsters at his hips. This was no ordinary traveler. This was Whiskey Jack, the notorious outlaw whose name was whispered in saloons and campfire tales across the territory. A wave of panic spread through the crowd. People screamed, scattering like frightened birds. They knew the name Whiskey Jack. He was known for his daring raids, his clever escapes, and a strange kind of justice he sometimes dealt out. But no one expected him here, now, in Harmony Creek, right in the middle of a hanging. Judge Blackwood, who had been standing proudly, turned pale. His mouth hung open, and his eyes, usually so sharp, were wide with disbelief and fear. Even the hangman froze, his hand still hovering over the lever, forgotten. All eyes were on the outlaw, who rode his horse right up to the gallows, stopping just feet away with a powerful snort from his steed. Whiskey Jack pulled back on the reins, his horse rearing slightly, its hooves pawing the air. The dust swirled around him, making him seem even larger, more dangerous. He swept his gaze over the terrified crowd, then up to Sarah on the gallows. For a moment, his eyes met hers, and she felt a jolt. She couldn't read his expression, hidden mostly by the shadows of his hat, but there was something fierce and unyielding there. "What in tarnation is going on here?" His voice boomed, cutting through the stunned silence. It was a voice used to being obeyed, a voice that carried the weight of authority, even if it was the authority of an outlaw. His question wasn't truly a question. It was a challenge, a declaration that things were about to change. The entire town of Harmony Creek reeled, caught between the fear of the gallows and the sudden, terrifying arrival of a legend. Whiskey Jack's booming voice hung in the air, a challenge no one in Harmony Creek dared to meet. His eyes, now visible as he tilted his head slightly, were sharp and focused. They landed on Judge Blackwood, who was trying to look brave but clearly shaking in his boots. "This woman ain't no witch," Whiskey Jack declared, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a whip. "And this ain't no proper justice." He then did something that made the whole town gasp even louder. With a quick, powerful movement, he drew a gleaming knife from his belt. Before anyone could react, he spurred his horse forward, leaped from its back, and landed lightly on the gallows platform right next to Sarah. The hangman, startled, stumbled backward, almost falling off the platform. Sarah, still trembling with fear and surprise, looked at Whiskey Jack, her eyes wide. He was taller than she expected, with a rugged, honest look that didn't quite match the stories she'd heard. Without a word, Whiskey Jack's strong hand went to the rope around her neck. In a flash, the sharp knife sliced through the thick hemp. The noose fell away, dropping to the dusty ground with a soft thud. He then quickly cut the ropes binding her wrists. Sarah rubbed her freed hands, staring at him, utterly bewildered. One moment she was facing death, the next she was free, standing beside a notorious outlaw. He turned to face the terrified crowd, his eyes scanning their faces. Then he did the unthinkable. He put an arm around Sarah's shoulders, pulling her gently but firmly against his side. Sarah stiffened, not understanding, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Hear me, Harmony Creek." Whiskey Jack's voice rang out, clear and strong, leaving no room for doubt. "This woman, Sarah Mae Jenkins, is under my protection. From this day forward, she is my wife." A collective gasp swept through the square. The townsfolk stared, mouths agape. Judge Blackwood looked like he might faint. A notorious outlaw, taking a witch for his wife? It was an insult to their so-called justice, a bold defiance of everything they believed. But who among them dared to challenge Whiskey Jack? No one moved. No one spoke. The audacity of his words, the sheer nerve of him, left them all speechless and frozen with fear. Sarah herself was reeling, unable to process what had just happened. Wife? His wife? It was a declaration that saved her life, but threw her into a new, terrifying mystery. The shock of Whiskey Jack's declaration was almost as great as the fear of the noose. Sarah stood frozen, his arm still lightly around her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the unbelievable turn her life had taken. She was no longer facing death, but she was now married to an outlaw, a man whose name brought shivers to the bravest souls. Whiskey Jack didn't wait for anyone to recover from their shock. He quickly led Sarah off the gallows, his grip firm but not rough. He helped her onto his black horse, then swung himself up behind her, taking the reins. The horse spun around, kicking up a cloud of dust, and with another fierce look at the stunned town, Whiskey Jack galloped away. They rode hard and fast, leaving Harmony Creek and its fearful people behind. Sarah clung to Whiskey Jack, her body stiff with a mixture of relief and raw terror. The wind whipped her hair, and the speed of the horse made her dizzy. She risked a glance back, seeing the small town shrinking in the distance, a place she had called home now a source of her greatest nightmare. As they rode deeper into the wild, the trees grew thicker, and the sounds of civilization faded away. Sarah felt a new kind of fear settle in her heart. What did this man want with her? Why had he saved her? Was it a trick? Was she merely exchanging one prison for another, a hanging for a life of fear at the hands of an outlaw? She knew the stories of Whiskey Jack, tales of his quick temper and his ruthless ways. Even though he had saved her, the reputation of a man like him was hard to shake. She couldn't bring herself to speak, her throat tight with unasked questions. She felt his arm around her, holding her steady, and it wasn't harsh, but it wasn't comforting either. It was just there, a strong presence. She felt small and helpless, a bird snatched from one trap only to be held in the hand of a stranger. She thought of Thomas, of the simple kindness he had shown her, and a pang of deep sadness went through her. This man was nothing like Thomas. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was filled with worry. She was free from the gallows, yes, but what kind of freedom was this? Freedom with a man she knew nothing about, a man who had claimed her as his wife without a single word to her. The questions swirled in her head, leaving her feeling more confused and scared than ever. She glanced at the dark figure behind her, a stranger who held her fate in his hands, and a shiver ran down her spine. As dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, Whiskey Jack finally slowed his horse. They had ridden far, deep into the wild lands where the trees stood tall, and the only sounds were those of nature. He dismounted first, then helped Sarah down. His touch was gentle, not at all like the rough outlaw she expected. He led the horse to a small stream to drink, and then started a small, smokeless fire, moving with a quiet skill that surprised her. Sarah sat on a fallen log, watching him, still wary. The fear of him lingered, a knot in her stomach. He offered her a piece of dried jerky and a sip from his canteen. "Eat," he said, his voice softer now, away from the demanding shouts of the town. "You've had a long day." Hesitantly, Sarah took the jerky. It was tough, but her hunger won over her fear. As they ate in silence, the firelight danced on his face, revealing lines that spoke of a hard life, but also a thoughtful gaze. He caught her watching him. "You're wondering why," he stated, not asking, but knowing. Sarah nodded, clutching the jerky tightly. "They were going to hang an innocent woman," he continued, looking into the flames. "That ain't right. Judge Blackwood is a snake, and those townsfolk are fools. I don't stand for that kind of justice." His words were firm, but without anger. He spoke of fairness, of right and wrong, in a way that surprised Sarah. He saw the doubt in her eyes. The wife part was to make sure they couldn't come after you. Law says a wife can't testify against her husband, and no man would chase after another man's wife, especially if that man is Whiskey Jack. He almost smiled, a brief, fleeting curve of his lips. Over the next few days, as they moved through the wilderness, Sarah started to see past the outlaw name. Whiskey Jack knew the land like the back of his hand. He found berries she didn't know were safe to eat, tracked animals for food, and built shelters that kept them warm and dry. He taught her how to set a snare and how to tell the time by the sun. He spoke little of himself, but his actions spoke volumes. He was quick to help, never leaving her behind, always making sure she was safe and comfortable. One evening, she saw him carefully tending to a bird with a broken wing, his large hands surprisingly tender. It was then that Sarah truly understood. This man was not cruel. He was driven by a deep, quiet sense of justice, a belief in what was right, even when the world around him was wrong. Her fear of him began to melt away, replaced by a growing sense of wonder and a fragile trust. Life on the run was hard, but each challenge they faced together chipped away at the last remnants of Sarah's fear and built a strong bridge of trust between them. One cold, rainy afternoon, they were caught in a sudden, fierce storm. The wind howled, and the rain lashed down, turning the forest floor into a muddy mess. They quickly sought shelter under a rocky overhang, huddling together for warmth. Whiskey Jack, ever watchful, kept an eye on the rising stream nearby, making sure they wouldn't be trapped. Sarah, for her part, used her knowledge of herbs to brew a warming tea from wild mint, helping to keep the chill at bay. They shared a quiet strength, each relying on the other in their own way. Another time, they stumbled upon a hidden trapper's camp. The trapper, a gruff man with a suspicious glare, saw Sarah first and immediately recognized her from the wanted posters that had begun to appear in distant towns, describing her as Whiskey Jack's witch wife. Before he could raise an alarm, Whiskey Jack stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his pistol. His voice was low, but firm, warning the trapper to mind his own business. Sarah, seeing the danger, stood tall beside him, her gaze unwavering. The trapper, sensing their shared resolve and Whiskey Jack's reputation, backed down. Later, Whiskey Jack looked at Sarah with a nod of approval. "You stood your ground," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. They learned to communicate without many words. A glance from Whiskey Jack would tell Sarah to be quiet or to hurry. A certain way Sarah held her head would let him know she was tired or needed a moment to rest. They worked together to build small fires, gather food, and find safe places to sleep. Sarah, with her gentle touch and keen eye for plants, became the camp's healer, tending to their small cuts and scrapes. Whiskey Jack, with his strength and knowledge of the wild, was their protector and guide. One evening, as they sat by a crackling fire, a pack of wolves howled nearby, their calls echoing through the dark forest. Sarah shivered, instinctively moving closer to Whiskey Jack. He put a comforting hand on her arm. "They're just singing their song," he said softly, his voice calm. "We're safe here." His steady presence, his quiet strength, made her feel protected in a way she hadn't felt since Thomas. She realized then that she no longer feared him. Instead, she trusted him completely. They were no longer just two people on the run. They were a team, bound by shared dangers and a growing, unspoken understanding. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as Sarah and Whiskey Jack journeyed through the vast, untamed lands. With each passing day, Sarah felt a change blossoming within her. The timid widow who had cowered before Judge Blackwood seemed like a distant memory. The wild, with its harsh lessons and breathtaking beauty, had awakened a strength she never knew she possessed. She learned to read the signs of the forest, to find safe water, and to identify edible plants that kept them fed. Her hands, once skilled in mending clothes and tending gardens, now competently handled traps and prepared wild game. She even learned to shoot a rifle with surprising accuracy, not for sport, but for protection, a skill Whiskey Jack patiently taught her. The recoil at first startled her, but soon she held the weapon with a steady hand, her aim true. Whiskey Jack saw this change in her, and he treated her not as a burden or a rescued damsel, but as a capable partner. He listened to her advice on where to find certain herbs or how to best mend a torn saddlebag. When they faced a difficult decision, he would look to her, his gaze asking for her thoughts, valuing her judgment. She was no longer just his wife by declaration. She was his equal, standing shoulder to shoulder with him against the challenges of the wild. One afternoon, they came across a small, struggling family whose wagon had broken down in a desolate pass. The father was hurt, and the mother was desperate. Without a moment's hesitation, Sarah stepped forward. She used her knowledge of herbs to ease the father's pain and, with Whiskey Jack's help, managed to fix a crucial part of their wagon. As the family tearfully thanked them, Sarah felt a surge of quiet pride. She had made a difference, not as a witch, but as a woman with skills and compassion. Later, as they rode away, Whiskey Jack looked at her, his eyes reflecting the setting sun. "You did good, Sarah," he said, his voice warm. "Real good." Sarah smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile that reached her eyes. She felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. The shame and fear that had haunted her in Harmony Creek had vanished. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was Sarah, strong and resourceful, living freely, making her own way. She no longer needed protection. She stood ready to face whatever came next, a true partner to the man beside her. The world stretched out before Sarah and Whiskey Jack, vast and wild, a canvas of endless possibilities. They had found a freedom in the untamed lands that no town, no judge, and no corrupt law could ever take away. Far from the harsh judgments of Harmony Creek, they built a life together, not bound by paper or ceremony, but by true partnership and a deep, growing love. Their home was wherever they laid their bedrolls, sometimes under the wide, starry sky, sometimes in a small, hidden cave. Each morning brought new adventures and new challenges, which they met as one. Sarah, with her newfound strength and wisdom, stood tall beside Whiskey Jack. She was no longer the quiet widow who bowed her head. She was a woman of the wilderness, her eyes bright with courage and a clear understanding of who she was. Their love was not born of grand words or easy times, but from shared dangers, quiet respect, and a deep appreciation for each other's spirit. Whiskey Jack, once a lone wolf, found a true companion in Sarah. Her gentle heart, combined with her fierce determination, softened the edges of his hard life. He saw her not as a witch wife to be protected, but as an equal, a partner whose insights and skills were just as important as his own. One clear evening, as the sun dipped below the distant mountains, painting the sky in fiery hues, they sat by a peaceful stream. Whiskey Jack turned to Sarah, his gaze soft and full of unspoken feelings. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you ain't just my protection anymore. You're everything." Sarah met his gaze, a warm smile gracing her lips. "And you, Jack," she replied, using the name she had come to call him, a name of comfort and trust. "You showed me that freedom isn't just about running away. It's about finding who you truly are." She stood up, tall and straight, her silhouette outlined against the fading light. He rose too, and they stood side by side, looking out at the endless horizon. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and wild earth. Sarah was no longer a victim, no longer haunted by the past. She was a woman who had faced death and found life, who had been accused of darkness and found her own light. She stood as an equal beside the man who had saved her, not from pity, but from a shared belief in justice. Together, they had found not just a refuge, but a true home in each other, under the vast, free sky of the Oklahoma Territory. Their journey was just beginning, a journey of freedom, love, and a life lived on their own terms.